here to talk about his work where he's really thought about how plants and ecosystems, soils respond to climate change, and he wants to use that to improve our models and understanding of climate change, and now he's trying to take it to the people. So Jeff, welcome to Tufts. It's great to have you.
Thanks very much, Colin. It's great to be here in a room with a whole bunch of people who I share a transcript with, apparently, or yeah, it's fun to be on campus. I can't believe I've never been here before, but terrific to be here now. How many of you are biologists or study biology in some way? Okay, so maybe a third of the room, something like that. How many of you are interested in climate change? Pretty much everybody. Okay, that's good. So I have something for everybody. I'm going to start out with some biology today and end up talking about climate change and its effects in Indiana. And in between, I'll cover some of both, I guess. My lab covers a lot of different topics here. We're interested in invasive species in general and what makes them successful and their impacts in different parts of the world. We're interested in how plants and ecosystems respond to climate change, simulated climate change, and other environmental changes. We're interested in improving the representation of plants and microbes in models. We do lots of things in lots of different systems. And today I've got to basically have three themes, three parts to this talk. And they'll go by fairly quickly, and I'm going to hit them at a fairly high level because I knew not all of you would be biologists. First, I'm going to start talking about how we represent ecosystems on land in models and some things that we've been working on in my lab to try to improve the realism of the models that represent the land surface in climate models. So I'll tell you a bit about climate models to kick off. Then I'll talk a little bit about this local experiment that Colin mentioned that he's leading now. He's one of the leaders of, but I started it back in 2008. It's the Boston Area Climate Experiment, and I'll give you some sense of what we did initially in that project and some of the major questions we looked at. And then finally, I'll talk about what we're doing in Indiana to help our fellow Hoosiers understand the potential consequences of climate change for the state as a way of sort of furthering the conversation about climate change in that state. So that's the program, and we'll start out talking about how we are trying to improve climate models. And this first part of the talk is really a lot of work that was done by a former graduate student of mine who finished recently by the name of Nick Smith, and we had several collaborators who are listed here who were important players on this work as well. So hopefully this graph, or this sort of graph, looks familiar to all of you. There are two curves superimposed here. One is temperature, global average temperature in red, and the other is smoothed, well, it's just annual carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere in yellow. What do you notice about this graph? Anything? Does anything jump out at you when you look at those two lines together? They're both rising at the same time, right? Basically. At the same rate. Shocking. That couldn't possibly be, there couldn't be a link there, could there? No way. So, correlation does not necessarily mean causation, right? Just because you've got two lines going up at the same time, the same rate, it doesn't necessarily mean one's causing the other, but we do know that there's this thing called the greenhouse effect, whereby carbon dioxide helps trap heat, helps basically the atmosphere warm up more, and re-radiate heat down to the surface. And so we understand that that's actually the primary cause of the increase in the global temperature. And we have models, climate models, that will represent this. We have dozens of climate models produced by groups around the world that are incredibly complex, that help us understand where we're headed in the future. So the red line now is shown in this graph by the green line. This is observed temperatures over time. And the other lines are all model representations of the past in the black and gray here, and then the future in the red and blue. The gray is just the range of the various different models, and and the lighter colored red and blue here. As we go into the future, we can't really predict what the future is because we don't know what people are going to do, right? We can construct a theoretical society in which we move as fast as humanly possible, as societally possible, away from fossil fuel use. And we even start storing a whole bunch of carbon, pulling it out of the atmosphere and storing it underground. And we can end up with this blue future here where climate change levels off over time in this what's known as RCP 2.6. Or we can envision a future where we depend increasingly even on coal going forward and really just burn everything we can get access to. And that basically represents this RCP 8.5 here. So that's a different possible future, and our climate models would predict a different climate in that sort of future society. So we have here then, between those two scenarios, a big uncertainty in our future planetary climate that's based on what human activities are going to be. All right? So it's important to understand that our actions are going to make a big difference on the future climate. But there's also some other uncertainties in here, even just within a model. And so if you go out on RCP 8.5 here into the future, you see that this light red area incorporates a lot of variation in temperature as well. And so that means that we have these different models that we're trying to represent the future climate with. We give them all the same scenario, and they tell us very different things about what the future temperature is going to be. And that's important if we're trying to set policies to try to narrow this window so that we actually understand what the consequences of our actions are going to be going forward with a little bit more certainty than we have now. This sort of variation here, or this variation here, is not ideal. So some of the work in my lab is trying to basically reduce this uncertainty here, or at least understand what leads to it, by working with these climate models. So what is a climate model? This is a graphical representation of one, the CESM1 BGC model that is sort of, or was hosted at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder, Colorado, but it's been worked on by people around the world. Each of these circles basically represents the amount of code, computer code, that goes into different submodels. So there's submodels for the atmosphere, the ocean, sea ice, the land surface. There's a coupler. So there are millions of lines of code involved in this model to represent how the Earth works, or how the global climate works. And the part that I'm interested in, being a plant ecologist, someone who works on ecosystems on land, is this land model down here. And specifically, I'm most interested really in the plants and vegetation. So this little amount of this model. But it turns out, and I'll show you in a minute, that component of the model is really important and is the source of a lot of uncertainty. So, so we want to narrow overall model uncertainty. To do that, we want to know what are the sources of uncertainty, and we can look at that in a minute. But I'll show you one of the reasons that plant and land responses are really important going forward. So every year we release a whole lot, billions of tons of carbon and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So 10 billion tons or more into the atmosphere. And most of this is coming from industry and fossil fuel burning, transportation, energy, all those things. About 10% of it comes from converting forests, primarily in the tropics, to agricultural lands. But the wonderful sort of thing about this is that of all that carbon dioxide we release to the atmosphere that acts to change our climate, less than half of it actually ends up staying in the atmosphere. So why is that? How is that? I could release a ton of carbon. Well, hopefully I don't release a ton of carbon. But anyway, I could release a ton of carbon into the atmosphere, but only half a ton stays there. How is that possible? Well, it turns out a quarter of what we release ends up dissolving into the ocean, basically, being taken up by the oceans. So that's good news for climate, bad news for anything that cares about ocean acidity, right? So that's not good for corals and ocean biodiversity. The other 30% or so ends up getting stored in plants and ecosystems on land. And an important question is, how long is that going to continue? If that continues, then that's great, that slows down climate change. But if what's called the land sink here, if it saturates, if the land surface is no longer able to take up all this additional carbon over time, then climate change happens faster in the future for each unit of carbon dioxide that we release. So we can look at different land models and say, well, what do they do in the future? Are they taking up more and more carbon dioxide, or are they releasing it? And unfortunately, well, each of these lines is a model here, and unfortunately, these land models give us very different answers. Some of them say that as we go forward into the future, the land surface is releasing a lot of carbon to the atmosphere instead of continuing to take it up. Some of them say it takes up more and more. So we've got 11 models graphed here with 11 very different answers. So this is a big source of the uncertainty in those future projections. So we want to narrow that down somehow. So some, I think, important questions then are, do the current land models that we have incorporate known plant responses to the environment? How realistic are they? Can we make them more realistic by making sure that all of the sort of plant and ecosystem behaviors, if you will, that we know about are actually mathematically represented in these models? So that's something we've been looking at. This is a review that I was involved in, and I don't expect you to read it all, but this is basically just highlighting lots of different measurements we could make or studies we could do that could potentially improve the functioning of land models in these ecosystem, land models within these climate models, reducing uncertainty. So there are many different areas we could tackle. Today I'm going to talk about basically a few areas in this box. So there's a study that was done that tried to jumble up different parts of models and see what parameters were most important in determining the climate going forward. And this is a little bit hard to read, but basically they looked at many different parameters here and got sort of no clear pattern. But when they looked at the optimum temperature for photosynthesis, they found that there was a good relationship between how that was represented in the models, the optimum temperature of photosynthesis, and what the CO2 concentration change was going forward in response to a given amount of CO2 release. This suggests that how models treat photosynthesis and its response to temperature really matters and is one of the big sources of uncertainty. And we know from decades of research, since the 70s, really, the early 70s, we know that the optimum temperature of photosynthesis for plants actually changes within a plant depending on the conditions that it experiences. So this is called temperature acclamation. And basically the idea is that if you have some long-term change in the temperature that a plant is experiencing, then the short-term or the instantaneous response of that plant's photosynthesis to temperature changes over time. The same thing happens for respiration too. So if you expose a plant to a new temperature regime, whether that is like fall instead of summer, or whether that is a warmer climate future instead of today, then the optimum temperature of photosynthesis is slowly going to change in response. It's not instant, it's a slow response. So you can think about it this way. If we look at the rate of photosynthesis here on the y-axis at a given leaf temperature, there's going to be a pattern like this. There's going to be some optimum temperature for photosynthesis. And that's going to shift if you grow the plant in cold conditions like the blue dots here versus if you grow it in hot conditions like the red line here. If the plant's grown under warmer conditions for a longer period of time, then the optimum temperature shifts higher and higher, even as the given rate of photosynthesis at any given temperature for the cooler temperatures might decrease. So it's important to get that relationship right in models, or at least it could be important. We think it's important, based on this previous research, to get that right in models. And there's lots of research suggesting that this is a real thing, as I've mentioned before. So this is just a summary of many studies that have been done looking at the optimum temperature for photosynthesis when plants have been grown at a couple different temperatures. And you see all these slopes going up, suggesting that the optimum temperature goes up when the plants are grown at warmer conditions. Now, if you look at different climate models, you see that not very many of them actually incorporate this process of temperature acclimation of photosynthesis. So Nick really summarized this for a whole bunch of models, looked into the code of a whole bunch of different ecosystem and climate models, and found that only a quarter of them actually had that. So the next question is, does that even matter, right? Is that a problem? Do we really see that models would do better if they incorporate photosynthetic temperature acclimation? So really we wanted to know three things. If we incorporate temperature acclimation into a model, does it improve the performance at a global scale, potentially reducing the uncertainty? If so, how does it influence future climate projections? And are the current formulations in models actually realistic? Do they represent what plants actually do when they do try to incorporate temperature acclimation? So starting out with the performance of global scale models, Nick led a project where we looked at basically how well a model would represent the photosynthesis in several different areas of the world if it included temperature acclimation or if it did not include temperature acclimation. And we had data from all the points in the world that are highlighted here, so some in the tropics, some in the temperate zones and the boreal zones. And so he ran a model with and without temperature acclimation to look at performance. And what he found was that sometimes in some of these locations, the model performed better, and in many locations, it didn't really matter too much. And it turned out that it was the tropics where the model performed better when you included acclimation. So at least it wasn't consistently worse anywhere. In general, it was better. And the tropics are a very important region for looking at overall global production. So this has the potential to be important. So it improved model performance in tropical sites, and we know those sites are important. So then, how does acclimation actually influence projections if you put it into a model? This is a separate question. What difference does it actually make? So to do this, we worked on a different study that was led by Danica Lamberdazzi, who's at NCAR, the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And she used the community land model, basically, to plug in acclimation, include acclimation, and say what difference does it make for future carbon storage. And it turned out that including acclimation in the model increased projected future carbon storage by something like 10 to 40 billion tons of carbon. So potentially a significant amount. Not like an earth-shattering, mind-blowing amount, but a potentially significant amount. This could also affect climate in a different way. So that's just looking at carbon storage, how much less carbon there would be in the atmosphere. Acclimation also is going to affect the photosynthesis rates of plants, and plants affect climate directly by changing the energy balance of a region. So if there's more transpiration, for instance, that is like a swamp cooler cooling a region, right? You're evaporating all this water, that takes energy, that cools down a region. So if you have higher photosynthesis, that has the potential to directly influence climate, not just going through the carbon cycle, but directly. So Nick led a study where he looked at this and found that acclimation meant higher photosynthesis in some regions of the world. And then that led to more latent heat flux, basically more transpiration. That led to local cooling in some parts of the globe because of this swamp cooler effect, this greater evaporation, but not much change in precipitation. So the blue areas here get cooler under acclimation, the red areas potentially get warmer. So what do we see in total across these different studies for the effect of acclimation? Well, there's a biogeochemical effect that's like 0.05 of a degree of a reduction. The biophysical effect on average is also about 0.05 of a degree reduction. So total is about 1/10 of a degree centigrade reduction of projected warming. Doesn't sound like a lot, but really if you translate that into how much carbon we would have to emit to cause that 1/10 of a degree change, it's actually pretty big. And in some areas, particularly the highly vegetated areas of the world, it actually translates to more than a degree centigrade of reduction. So for some parts of the world, this could be truly meaningfully important, not just sort of theoretically important on the global scale. Okay, the next question is, are current formulations of acclamation even realistic? We're plugging in a formulation that has been done previously, and we were interested, this formulation sort of assumes that all plants are the same, and we were interested in understanding, are there actually differences among plants and how they acclimate? And so Nick did a study where he grew 22 species of plants in a common environment in a greenhouse, and then he exposed them to different temperatures in growth chambers and studied their photosynthesis and respiration and looked at particularly how the photosynthesis temperature optimum changed and that sort of thing. And you know, most of you don't really care that much about the results, so I'm not going to go into them in too much detail here, but we did see changes. And particularly, we found changes between C3 and C4 plants, so that there is some, you know, it does actually matter how you represent acclimation. But C4 plants aren't a huge proportion of the global photosynthetic inventory. So anyway, might not be that crucial. You don't care that much about this, but I'm just giving you the basic idea. So maybe the acclimation formula could be improved, but because not all plants acclimate the same, but it's maybe not that big a deal. So then the question is it worth trying to improve these formulations, and how would you go about doing this? And that's something that really Nick is looking into in his further research now. He's a professor now at Texas Tech University and is still thinking about these sorts of issues. But I'll just say that one challenge of that's sort of this constant tension in the climate change research community, the terrestrial ecosystem climate change research community, is that experimentalists like me who like, I don't know, torturing plants and seeing how they respond, we always want all of these plant responses to be in the climate models. It's like, are you kidding me? It doesn't do this random thing that plants do? That's crazy, you modelers. Why aren't you putting it in there? And the modelers respond like, are you kidding me? Do you know how expensive it is to put another equation into these models? How much testing we have to do, how much slower that makes the model run, and how expensive that ends up being because the models run slower, and how much less productive we are because of it. So it's got to actually really matter for them to be willing to make their model more complex. So there's this tension going on, and you've got to show that it really matters a lot before the modeler will say, okay, fine, I'll throw it in. Okay, so that's the first part. Now I want to talk about some work that I started locally here in Massachusetts, and that really Professor Oriens is continuing and taking in sort of a different direction. So this is looking at what we can understand, what we can find out about how local ecosystems will respond to a changing climate. And particularly the hypothesis that I had for this experiment was that in a warmer future, the amount of precipitation that we get will matter more for plant growth and ecosystem respiration, basically for carbon exchange in ecosystems, the rate at which carbon is taken out of the atmosphere and put back to the atmosphere during the growing season and other times of year as well. And so we tested this in the Boston area climate experiment, which is 5 miles away from here in Waltham. So these are some pictures of the project. You can see it, you know, in the summer and in the winter. You can see in the winter here that we've got different warming treatments. You can see they've melted out. So this is an old field ecosystem. We've planted in some tree seedlings to this. There are 4 different levels of warming, and you can see so there's an unwarmed plot here and a slightly warmed plot, and then as it gets warmer, you see the snow disappearing entirely in the winter. There are 3 different precipitation regimes, so areas with some polycarbonate slats over the plots. You can see them up here too that had 50% of the ambient precipitation. And then some areas with sprinklers. You can sort of see these black lines here that got 150% of ambient precipitation, and some areas that just got whatever fell, the normal ambient precipitation, right? So that's 12 total treatments, 4 levels of warming crossed with 3 precipitation regimes. 3 replicates of each treatment. So we had 1 replicate of each treatment in each of these experimental blocks here, these sort of greenhouse type structures. And this experiment was started in August of 2008. And basically we had a whole bunch of square plots, 36 of these square plots, where we had trees in little squares within them. And we would be measuring things like biomass that grew in certain areas each year, measuring growth of the trees, measuring growth of the roots in what we call root ingrowth cores, lots of different measurements going on in these plots, and I really won't go into many of them in detail. But the idea was that that the response of the ecosystem to warming would depend on how much precipitation it got. So in the drought treatment, you might expect that warming would actually, say, decrease productivity or decrease respiration, that sort of thing, as it got drier and drier. In the wet treatment, where the plants would have plenty of moisture, maybe warming would be a good thing for them. Maybe the plants would grow faster. This was the sort of hypothesis that we wanted to test. Maybe in the ambient treatment, a little bit of warming would be good, a little bit more would be bad. And going forward, note that the wet treatment are always represented in blue, and the drought treatment in brown, and the ambient in black. And you'll see some figures that look like this going forward. So the treatments that we put in place sort of are represented by these blue dots here. These are the different levels of warming and drought that we were shooting for. So first off, we can look at plant growth. If we look at the growth of the old field vegetation, the grasses and forbs, wildflowers, that sort of thing, how is that going to respond to these different treatments? Well, so it turned out, shockingly to me, that if you drought these plots, if you take away half the precipitation in Waltham, or if you add 50% extra precipitation, it had absolutely no effect on the above ground plant growth of the grasses and forbs. So I'll represent that by this little orange bar that sort of shows the variation among the treatments. Statistically, these are all exactly the same. So what happens when you warm them up? Yeah, again, how can they be so resistant to precipitation change? That was just really strange. But if you warm them up, suddenly it does matter. And it starts to look a little bit like that hypothesis figure that I showed you. So there may not be much variation over here when they're under ambient temperatures, but under the warmest of the warming treatments, you see a real variation where the drought treatment, the dry treatment, has actually reduced production. And if anything, the plants are growing better with the warming in the ambient and wet treatments. Now that's looking at sort of this vegetation in here, the grasses and forbs, wildflowers. But we also had trees growing in these plots, so tree seedlings. And you can sort of see the results from the trees just from this slide without my showing you the data. I will show you the data in a minute. But in the foreground here, you can see we're in a dry treatment with these slats above the plot. This is the square plot here. You can see the heaters on the corners. Over here, you have a wet plot. There's a sprinkler system up here. So this is also heated. This gets the high warming, just like this one does. And you can see what's going on in this plot over here is these trees are a lot bigger when they're wet and warm than when they're dry and warm. We can see that also if we look at the heights of different tree species. So here we've got red maple, we've got a birch species, a pine species, and an oak species here, red oak. So again, if we look at the if we look at the unwarmed treatments, there is shockingly very little difference in the growth rates of these plants under different precipitation conditions. So I would think they would respond more to precipitation than this, but they did not. But when you warm them up, suddenly you do see these big responses where under the wet conditions, the plants are growing much faster, they're getting much taller, and under the dry conditions, they're not. If anything, they're declining. So basically, the hypothesis that I put forward at the beginning turned out to be the case, or at least close to it. When warmed, the plants were more sensitive to precipitation. And so that's a check. We also wanted to look at other variables. So plant growth is one way of looking at how fast carbon is coming out of the atmosphere into an ecosystem. We wanted to look at the reverse process, ecosystem respiration. So we looked at soil respiration to represent part of that. And it turned out that this was true as well. We saw the same basic pattern. I'll show you that figure now. So here we're looking at, again, CO2 efflux, so how fast the carbon dioxide is coming out of the soil under these different conditions. And again, you see that the precipitation didn't matter that much under ambient temperatures. But as you warmed up the ecosystem, suddenly you had much faster soil respiration under the warmed conditions than you do under the dry conditions, because under the dry conditions, the soil respiration is slowing down quite a bit. So similar pattern. We have the larger spread as you go to the right. So from this experiment, we found that both plant growth and soil respiration become more sensitive to precipitation when they're warmed up. And those two effects can offset each other, basically. From the system overall, it seems that under drought conditions, the carbon cycling slows down, becomes, let's see, the system takes up carbon more slowly under drought conditions overall than it does under the wetter conditions. But this is just one system. The details of what happens in this system aren't important globally, but ideally what we can do is use experiments like this to sort of, fact check is a little strong, but to test models and see if the models are getting the general patterns right. If the models are behaving the same as the ecosystems, that gives us more confidence in them. If they're not, then we want to think about why not. Is that something that's not happening in the model that should be, or is that something that's maybe happening in the ecosystem that's maybe not, maybe it's an artifact of the design, or maybe it's just something that's not represented in the model that's important. Okay, so all that work that I just showed you was done with support from many institutions and many people. I don't want to give you the illusion that this is all my work at all. I want to make sure that I thank all these folks and many other helpers who were involved with this project during that period of time. And I want to take a little bit of time now to just talk about probably the project I'm focusing on the most at this point in time, which has to do with the implications of climate change for the state of Indiana, where we're using a climate change impact assessment to really get a little bit more conversation going and hopefully bring more awareness to the public about what it can do to us, those of us in the Midwest who are not on a coast, who are not getting hit by hurricanes, not getting hit by fires or wildflowers, hopefully. So why should people in the Midwest care? Why should they care, if so? So do you know how many scientists think that global warming is actually happening? Anybody want to throw out a number? What percentage of scientists think global warming is happening? The actual number. This is what the public thinks anyway. It's different than what percentage of climate scientists thinks that the climate is actually changing? Yeah, right. It's in the high 90s, right? So, yes. So, and what percent of scientists think that that's because of human activities in some way? High 90s. Yes. Good. You guys know more than the average Hoosier. Okay, so, or the average American for that matter, right? So in Indiana, well, this is a different question. This is not what percent. This is just, do most scientists think that global warming is happening? And people don't know, let alone know that most scientists is in the high 90s. In Indiana, only 43% of people would agree with this statement that most scientists think global warming is happening, and the national average is 49%, so less than half. So people don't know that there's a scientific consensus about what's going on with the climate, which is crazy and is a huge stumbling block to actually making any progress on this issue. This is changing a bit, but you can see there's a big sort of urban-rural dichotomy as well. When you get into some of the more rural parts of Indiana, you have states where only you have counties where only a quarter of people actually understand that scientists are in consensus that this is actually going on. Yeah, if you go to Tippecanoe County where Purdue is and I'm from, or if you go down here to Monroe County where Indiana University is, you'll see little pockets of orange where people understand that more people understand the science. But in general, people don't know that. And this is an updated study from IU, so it's gone up a little bit potentially to 52%, but still, it's not that many. And then how many people think global warming is harming their local community? It's still a minority of people in most of the state, not all of the state. So that's and most of the Midwest. So this is the background here in the state. Update is that may be changing. 77% felt that climate change will harm Indiana's economy somewhat or to a great extent in a survey that was done this year. So that may have shifted over the last few years. But what we are trying to do at the Purdue Climate Change Research Center is create an assessment that'll have a few different outcomes. One is it'll produce usable information for people in the state about climate change. It'll build a network of experts on climate change. And it'll increase the dialogue about climate change in the state. And hopefully, eventually, will help people come up with solutions to climate change on a variety of different levels based on the information that we put out. And fortunately, that already seems to be happening. So there have been many assessments done on climate change and its impacts. What's unique about ours? Well, first of all, it has no Band-Aid and no funding. We just decided to do this as a center at Purdue. This was not something that was led by the state. This is not something that's mandated by the country. But we felt like we could make a big contribution anyway by producing this. We felt like we had the sort of authority, if you will, to lead this. So it's a 100% bottom-up effort. We have technical contributions to the assessment from about 100 experts across the state of Indiana. So we're gathering local experts. We're not going outside the state very much. We're getting local experts to give us input on how climate change is going to affect the state. We're putting out paired reports. One set of reports is peer-reviewed scientific literature. Based on that, we're creating public-facing reports that go up on the web and are sort of more policymaker-friendly and public-friendly, if you will. With a real focus on user needs and user involvement. So we started out this whole process by going out to stakeholders around the state and asking what information they needed to know, whether they were in agriculture or public health, tourism and recreation. We said, what do you need to know about climate and climate change to do your job better in the coming decades? And then we've tried to create reports that would answer those questions. So this is sort of the setting, the ingredients that we have to put out these reports. We've used a process that's, I think, different than many assessments. But it's because we want to hit these goals. We want to have broad public awareness that we're doing this assessment to help increase the conversation about climate change. We want to make sure that people actually buy into this. So that's why we go to the stakeholders first and ask them what they want and have them involved in actually the creation of the reports and reviewing the outlines and drafts of these reports going forward. We want them to understand that these are reports that are trying to answer their questions and are using credible information. And we want them to help people identify what the actual implications of climate change are and impacts of climate change are right now and into the future for our state. So we are trying to maintain communication with people through many different outlets, whether it's our newsletter or regular social media posts, a whole variety of sort of approaches to trying to keep communication going on. Again, we got formal and informal feedback from stakeholders before the assessment. And during the development of the assessment, we've been, again, in contact with stakeholders trying to get their feedback. When we release the reports, we do it in community events. We originally were doing it in what we called press conferences, and the press didn't show up, so then we called them community briefings, and then suddenly the press all showed up. So great, we're doing community briefings. And we make sure that we provide a lot of media resources that are sort of public friendly with each report. So it's basically the idea is that the whole thing, all the ingredients of the report should be easy to steal so that people can give their own presentations on these, so that they can put them in their newspaper, so they can do whatever they want with them. They can use them in as many ways as possible. And then after the release of each report, we try to continue sort of reaching out to the public, talking to people around the state about what's going on. And as the possibilities come up, we'll pursue new partnerships as well. So where are we in this process? Well, we determined that there were 10 reports, basically, that would make sense to put together at the time being, for which we had the suitable interest and expertise. And so these are the different topics that we came up with. And 8 of these are online now. So we've released 8 starting in March of last year. We were releasing these at individual events. They're available at indianaclimate.org if you're interested in what they look like. There's the public-facing version, there's a web version, there's also a PDF that's accessible, and then there's the technical report that is, you can sort of click through to if you want to understand the backing information that's behind this report, the original report that the experts put together on this topic. We're about to release our water resources report. We're getting ready to do that in early December. And the infrastructure report will come out next year. So again, lots of different formats. I mentioned most of this already. Public-facing reports are online in a PDF format, lots of graphics, not too much technical detail in the public-facing reports. They're referenced, but not excessively, so they're still readable. You're not running into a reference every 5 words like you might in a scientific paper. And we have these technical reports available as backup. And so this is an example of the sorts of graphics that we have. This is a graphic about how much the tile drainage will change going forward in Indiana, so from March to May. So tile drainage, how many of you have even heard of a tile drain before? Does anybody know what that is? I had no clue, Eric. All right, good.
I think I heard it on NPR when I lived in Illinois.
Okay, Eric Scott will now give us a description of how tile drainage works. You ready? No? Okay. All right. So tile drains are they're really important in a lot of the Midwest where you have heavy clayey soils that saturates with water and you wouldn't be able to plant them for much of the year because you just have ponding. There are these perforated pipes that are laid below ground, and I don't know how far below ground, maybe that much, just below the rooting zone basically. And the idea is that they lay them in these parallel strips. And if you think of the soil as being like a bathtub when it's saturated with water, the tile drains, since there are these perforated pipes, they just allow the water to drain out down to the height of the pipes. So they pull water out of these fields really fast so that people can plant them sooner and so that they get sort of a longer effective growing season. But one side effect of that is that a lot of the nutrients, the fertilizers that are put on the fields can sort of percolate down along with the water and drain out rapidly into the rivers and down to the Gulf of Mexico and create this massive dead zone, which you've probably heard about somewhere else, but if not, you should learn about it. It's important. Anyway, all that to say, we can create graphics like this that show that the increase in tile drainage in the spring is going to be really impressive in this zone, and that has implications for water quality as well as water quantity and dealing with floods downstream of agricultural areas in Indiana. Other examples of graphics that we've put together are things like this, where we're looking at what are the mild temperatures in green, how many days of mild temperatures will we have versus hot and extremely hot temperatures in the past and up through the 2080s under different future climate scenarios, showing like that our summers could be just dominated by really uncomfortable days going forward, and this would have implications for tourism and recreation. How our climate might move in the future to resemble that of Western Tennessee or even Houston under a high emissions scenario by the end of the century. How many extremely hot days are we likely to have in Indianapolis, for instance, or in the north of the state or in the south of the state? So we try to put together these sorts of graphics that we hope are sort of user-friendly and will be stolen by many people. So what are we doing to get the word out? We have a newsletter, a monthly newsletter. We do speaking events all the time, all over the state. Social media, op-eds, we haven't done too many yet, but that's something we may do more of in the future. And community briefings. The community briefings that I mentioned that are not press releases, but or press events at all, but the press show up, hopefully, they have been done in different parts of the state. So we put out a video recap of them. We do a lot of social media around them. We do actually a press release, even though it's not a press conference, technically. And we reach out to lots of organizations and media when we do each one. And we do them in different parts of the state so that we hit different media markets in the state. So we started out in Indianapolis. We've done a couple there. We've done some in Bloomington, West Lafayette. Up in the northern parts of the state, we've done a couple. And the next one's going to be, oops, I keep doing that. The next one's going to be in Fort Wayne to try to just sort of round out the state. And then we'll probably do our last one down near Louisville, which is not in Indiana, but it's just across the river. Okay, so how do we measure whether this is making any difference? That's something that's difficult for us to figure out, really. So, we've had lots of front page coverage and various other newspaper coverage. We've got quotes from different communities. Many communities have used our information. We do lots of events around the state. We've talked to thousands and thousands of people around the state. We've got, we can count how many downloads we've had of the PDF versions of the reports or the visits to the just regular online versions of the reports. We feel like we're making a difference. We're talking to policymakers now. They're interested, but it's really hard to figure out what's enough, what's success. I don't know. I feel good about it, but it's hard to know. So what does the future hold? More communications, pushing things out to the schools and to the public in different ways, through our extension community, for instance. Filling some research gaps on the topics that we've covered so far, so sustaining the assessment through sort of hitting additional areas. Continuing to assess our research, to assess our reach in the state and whether people's perceptions of climate change are shifting over time. And continuing to share this information with policymakers at many levels and seeing how they use it and what happens. Those are sort of the future goals of all this. So if you're curious about this report, you can find it again at indianaclimate.org. Melissa Widholm has been the driving force in this whole report. She's coordinating it and has been really, none of it would have been possible without her. If you're curious in how we're pushing it out on social media, it's mostly happening through at Purdue CCRC with the hashtag INCCIA. Yeah, you're welcome to contact me. If you don't have a chance to get a question in today, you're welcome to contact me about any of this at any time. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you, Jeff, for a fascinating talk, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Quick question about going back to the ecology bit. Have you been including nitrogen and phosphorus limitations in your experiments and models? And just hope you could follow up further on that.
Yeah, that's a really good question. One of the, so I was involved in some papers in 2003, way back when, where we looked at what the implications were of including or not including nitrogen in those models. And we basically found that, that you would expect nitrogen to limit the response to CO2 of global land carbon uptake, and that should be really important in, and that basically suggested that the existing models were all unrealistically optimistic in how much carbon was going to be pulled out of the atmosphere. Since then, I haven't worked on that topic too much, but more and more models are including a nitrogen cycle in them. More and more of these land models are. And what you are seeing is that if you look at like that uncertainty graph, that sort of spaghetti graph that I showed, the models that are less optimistic about future carbon uptake, that say that, you know, climate change is going to be worse because we won't be capturing as much carbon on land, those are typically the ones that have a nitrogen cycle in them. And so it is becoming more and more common that nitrogen cycles are being incorporated, and those are getting also more sophisticated at this point. It's early for the phosphorus and other nutrient limitation to be incorporated into these models. There are several people who are thinking about that. It's a really active topic of research right now, but it's not something that is common in models yet. So we're maybe 2/3 of the way there on incorporating nitrogen into models, if you look across all these models, and like maybe 0 to 5% of the way there on all the other nutrients. Phosphorus is more important. Phosphorus limitation, as you probably know, is more important in the tropics, or thought to be much more important in the tropics, and other nutrients are thought to be more limiting in the tropics as well. And the tropics are so productive that it's critical to capture that. So, yeah. Sure. Oh,
Hey,
yeah. Hey.
I had a question about with the climate science, the local stuff. If you had any collaborations with sociologists or plans to collaborate, I've been thinking about it lately that you're right. You know, the science is there. There's this consensus among scientists, and really, where the work is, where there might be a place for work to be done is, communicating that idea and convincing people of it, and figuring out the science of how people are swayed in arguments, right? And this idea that throwing facts at people doesn't tend to change their minds.
Yeah. That's certainly true, and really important. There's a lot of, I think, fascinating research that's done in that realm that shows that, yeah, stories can be important. Hearing this message from your trusted information sources is really important. Hearing facts from scientists is not typically going to change people's mind. I don't know why not. Come on, people, right? I mean, like, but yeah. So you have to figure out how do you turn this information into, or how do you identify, compelling stories that people will get and that will help people understand what's going on. One of the ways that we're trying to do that in our center is through producing some videos where we have basically different people's stories about how climate change is affecting them, what it means to them. I don't know that a few YouTube videos are going to save the world, but it's something we're trying to do because we need to reach people in different ways, and we're trying to do that in as many different ways as possible. We do have some people at Purdue who are really interested in the climate change communication aspect of things. We have, for instance, a fantastic professor in the psychology department named Aaron Hennis, who shows up at every one of our practice briefings. So we do a practice community briefing before we do the actual thing, a couple days earlier. And she comes up she comes there each time and basically helps us figure out how to convey that message in a more effective way, because she knows that research really well. We're not doing any actual research like that associated with this, but we're trying to incorporate best practices, essentially. So, yeah. Yes?
I have a compliment and a question.
Okay.
First, a compliment. As a plant ecologist, I have to say I'm blown away by your dedication and effort to use your research for broader applications and to make it relevant and accessible to the community. And I think more scientists should be thinking about how to make that accessible and understandable.
Thank you.
So that was my compliment. My question is to follow up Eric's questions. I was wondering, in a state where only half of the people are on board with this idea, how do you do target outreach to, for example, groups like farmers, where this may be linked to a political connotation, and maybe they are not able to accept some things? Do you do target outreach, and if so, how do you overcome the political connotation that some people associate with climate change?
Yeah, the answers are yes, and I don't know. So we do a lot of outreach to farmers. I mean, Purdue is a land-grant university. It's the state university of Indiana. So we're known for our agricultural research. We're known for our engineering research as well. There are many state universities in Indiana, but we have an Indiana State University, so I can't really say that, but we're sort of like a UC Davis or a Michigan State or that sort of thing. And so we have great relationships with farmers. We have our own extension outreach program. And Melissa and I we go out and talk to farmers many, many times in January and February, because those are the months when they have their sort of local meetings of the soil and water conservation districts and their various other sort of relevant groups. So we talk to dozens, hundreds of farmers easily each winter. And we're trying to broaden that now by talking to all of our extension educators and trying to equip them to talk to farmers about climate change as well with the information that we have here. So we have a meeting coming up in about a month where we have all of the extension educators around the state who work with farmers will be gathered at this meeting. And so we're going to have a couple presentations to them on how to do this. Trying to get the message right, and so you don't turn them off, is it's really dependent on the farmer. And typically, there are many, many farmers that are on board with all this, and I will hear from them after I give a talk. They'll come up and talk to me. And the many, many other farmers who might not be on board with this typically don't say much. So it's hard to know. I mean, you know that some people are uncomfortable even with the terms climate change, or even like practically with the term climate, which is a little bit crazy because they're farmers, right? So I start out with some of these talks trying to just talk about the most simple, like ridiculously simple thing, which is the difference between climate and weather. But just to get it on that page so we have a definition we're all comfortable with, and then go through how we know that they're both important for farming, and so here are the implications of both of these as they go forward. But in the end, they may be, it's possible that they get turned off by the terminology sometimes, but I think that the information that we provide to farmers is really relevant, and also they're out there, they see the weather, they experience it, and they are affected by it all the time, and they know that precipitation has been changing in Indiana. They know that the weather has been stranger, recently. And I start out all my presentations talking about observations and what we've seen in the past, how the climate has changed already. Because I think that also helps get everyone on the same page of, this is not the climate that we had 50 years ago. Here are the differences, and the projections are largely just extending that line forward in time. Maybe the slope changes a little bit, but it's not inconsistent with what their lived experience is. So I've gotten remarkably little pushback from farmers. I think that's going to be tested a little bit this summer, this winter in December. I won't be there, but there's going to be a big conference of the farm. Which one is it? The Farm Bureau, I guess, in southern Indiana, and thousands of farmers there, and we're going to do a presentation there. And I don't know how that's going to go, but the people doing it, the people who will be there doing it are fantastic extension educators from Purdue who know how to talk about climate. They talk about climate with farmers all the time, and I'm sure that it'll be conveyed in a way that's useful and accessible to farmers and not in a way that will turn them off.
We should probably stop there, but I just want to make one quick observation, is that one of the things I really loved is about how you embedded technical reports and public-facing reports from the same information. And it seems like an incredibly important skill. And I could imagine it's a skill that our undergraduates and graduate students would want to sort of perfect. And so the degree to which courses could be designed about or hackathons, or like a Saturday event, let's do something that's both technical and outward facing. Is there, if we can slip this in really 30 seconds, are you doing anything in the training of that kind of communication? And
Yeah.
are you working with someone in the communications?
So we're not really doing any training on that. That'd be great, but this has been focused on more on the products than the process of and the potential training associated with it. I think that's a great idea. I'll just briefly say that the reason that we're basing this on technical reports is we want the experts to all contribute, and we want to get their knowledge, but we don't want to have them having to make public-facing reports, which that's not their expertise, and it's potentially a waste of their time. So we want them to be doing things they're going to get rewarded for, which is these peer-reviewed papers, right? So they produce those, then we take those, we work with the communications team to produce a nice public-facing report, saving time of the experts from doing that, but hopefully advertising their research to a much bigger audience. So that's sort of how they pair together. I love the idea of bringing in students, but I don't know if I can handle that additional ball juggling.
Yes.
So, yeah.
Well, let's thank Dr. Dukes one more time.